we have a situation. The power grid's down. Everyone's freaking out. A lot of people, unfortunately, have died. There's other issues that are going on. Everything is coming together. Yet this would still be a disaster just from the weather, but if the state of Texas had learned from 2 previous times to kind of shore up their power grid, we wouldn't have had this situation. We're going to talk about why this is a crisis in this video. As often when we do these case studies, we always try to explain why is this a crisis. So it's called the 2021 power crisis for a reason. Physically, what happened? The power grid experienced massive failings, coal-fired, natural gas-fired, the renewables, the wind and solar, the geothermal, the hydraulic, everything, generally speaking, was hit by the cold and wasn't working properly. So you ended up having the results, power cuts, the whole power grid was literally on the verge of collapsing. People ended up losing their lives in their homes because there was no heating, there was no gas, it was just a total quagmire. The power impacted the economy to the point that there could be as much as $150 billion in secondary expenses brought on by this disaster. So why is it a crisis? Well, one, you had 3 large-scale, once-in-a-decade storms hit. So the storms created a crisis. The power grid was impacted. That caused further crisis. You've already got a certain COVID issue going on in the background. And then you had a large number of people who, unfortunately, were killed because of the consequences of the storm. And a lot of this was from people just trying to stay warm in their homes. So their heater was pumping out carbon monoxide. They literally succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. And that is where somebody has, like when we breathe in and out, we produce oxygen or carbon dioxide. But CO, or carbon monoxide, is CO1. What that does is it displaces the oxygen in your blood, and effectively you die of asphyxiation. You die from, like your cells and everything is unable to get oxygen. The carbon monoxide was killing people. Or they couldn't get any heating. They died from basically exposure inside their homes. They literally froze inside their homes. People, of course, were on the roads. There were traffic accidents. People died from that. People died from falling. So a certain amount of deaths were to be expected from this mega storms that hit 1, 2, 3. But a lot of deaths that were not expected. People died from exposure in their homes. People died from carbon monoxide poisoning because they couldn't get heating. So why is it a crisis? You had the deaths, you had the damage to the economy, the power grid was failing, you had already pre-existing ongoing problems, the COVID crisis, you had all of this all came together. Why is this such just a mind-numbing type of crisis? A lot of the time, you're going to have once-in-a-lifetime floods. You're going to have fires. You're going to have events that are completely unpredictable and could not be seen happening. But this one did. 2011, the Groundhog Day storm. It was between February 1st and February 5th. There was a large-scale snowstorm, like a once-in-a-decade type of cold front that came in, caused nothing but chaos, and hit the weather or the power systems again. And then, a decade before that, also the same thing happened. Twice this had hit the power grid, and each time there were reports that were brought up to say, this is what we got to do. We got to do A, B, and C. And yet nothing was ever done. We just had 2021 hit, and the same preventable secondary crises could have been prevented if these things were implemented before. And what am I talking about? The reports that were filed in the past found that if Texas did not weatherize their power production facilities, if they had not properly got their system disaster-proofed, which that it means providing heat to certain weather-dependent or weather-impacted type of pumps or doing something of that nature. So critical infrastructure that was vulnerable to the cold. Weatherize it. That means put heating on it, put systems in place that could prevent these from freezing or being damaged by the cold. could have prevented a lot of key parts of the infrastructure and the systems from collapsing. Here's a simple rule of thinking. The more complex your system, the more small little things can end up causing total and absolute crises. No matter how simple your system is, there's always going to be key choke points, key weak points that are going to get hit. And if you know about these in advance, you can create mitigation strategies that will prevent or at least reduce the potential of secondary and tertiary catastrophic failures. With respect to Texas, here's some interesting things to think about. Texas never wanted to be a part of the federal mandated power grid. So Texas has its own independent power grid. Two, they have a nonprofit system known as ERCOT that runs and operates the power system. So they set prices, they have a certain set of regulatory powers under their mandate to get all of the power system run. And then three, all the independent power producers, those are coal-fired, that is natural gas, that is renewables, that's geothermal, that's hydroelectric, it's whatever. Anybody who can create power will tap in and add to the system. Well, the problem that then becomes here is that, on the one hand, ERCOT literally was steadily being gutted. All of the secondary and advisory boards and all of the extra government oversight was steadily being stripped over the years by each of the successive governors over the years and the powers that be inside of the legislatures to make the system completely unable to deal with crisis. So that's one. So regulations were gutted and the protection that these oversights provide were removed. The very nature of Texas, there is no oversight from a federal level or other bodies to basically demand legal changes. So you have the structure of their independent power grid is a vulnerability in and of itself because regulation is almost non-existent and it's literally the power suppliers themselves generally self-regulate and are only advised to take certain precautions and are never really required. So point three, the economics of this is that unless all the power suppliers effectively are brought on at the same time, no one is going to effectively regulate or do what's needed to powerize their systems. So effectively, this ultimate act of selfishness that it would be required for everybody to just either spend, say, $50,000 per pump to weatherize it so that the natural gas could be safely injected into the system so that it goes into the feeder systems that then go into the burners that then generate the steam and generate the thrust for the generators, or the wind turbines by having heating coils and heating pads where they're needed to prevent critical parts of the wind turbine from freezing. Well, because all the power suppliers effectively were never required to do this, they were voluntarily advised to, and result is nobody did it because why? It's like, it's not, this is maybe like, this will be on someone else's job that this will impact. So again, you almost have this selfishness. The fourth point on this is that when the power grid was so all of a sudden compromised, because literally there was so lack of foresight and so lack of planning and so lack of response or care, you literally had a system set up that the power suppliers that were able to at least supply the power for that time, ERCOT set such insanely high rates for people who could actually get power. You ended up seeing someone's regular power bill on a daily basis with maybe $20, all of a sudden was pumped up to like as much as $200. So for that time period, that ERCOT was in crisis and all of the power system was having these rolling blackouts. The effect was, well, a lot of people made a lot of money, and literally it was like adding that, like just driving the screws in even more. So it was a little lack of caring and a lack of compassion. Add on to that, there seems to be like this very Texas mentality that, you know what, we don't really want regulation. We do not want things that make sense. Because half the time, yes, sometimes business regulation can go from one extreme to the other. Well, in Texas's case, versus say California, where California goes way over to the consumer protection and way over legislating behavior and expectations, Texas does the opposite and tries to get away with as little as possible. The end result in this case is that lives are probably lost because people were not mandated to change. So in 2011 and the decade before that, there was this once-in-a-decade storm. And it was impressed upon everybody that there was reports done, government action was filed, that what was recommended is that the different power grids get weatherized. So each type of power system, that could be thermal, that could be wind, that could be whatever, has to do some industry-specific things depending on what you have. For instance, if we look at Wisconsin, which is a lot colder place and gets a lot colder weather and a lot more freakish winter storms than, say, Texas, they have heat pads or even just heated coils around certain parts of their equipment that keep it warm or above freezing so that the systems keep going, so that you don't lose that power generation. If you look at, for instance, the natural gas, a lot of the simple failures of a very complex system was that certain exposure points on the outside of the plants where the natural gas pipe is brought in to the pumps, these were identified as critically vulnerable to cold temperatures. So what ended up happening is that the freezing or the cold weather effectively froze the pumps, and they weren't able to maintain a steady supply of natural gas to the injector systems that go into the burning part of the turbine, which then either they use that to create steam, or they boil water from the energy that's being burnt to create steam that powers the turbines, or the heat that comes from that generates a thrust that runs the turbines, depending on whatever system that you use. But these are examples of how things are screwed up. Or even look, say, at the thermal coal fire. So that's the coal that is burned in furnaces that generate heat, that generate, obviously, the steam or what have you to generate the turbines. Well, the thing is, the conveyors, for instance, at one plant were not weatherized. The cold weather froze the ball bearings or froze the control rods or the rollers on each of the sections of conveyors. So the system could still run, but the coal feed couldn't be maintained because these conveyors were effectively useless in the cold. These were the same types of problems that were identified back in 2011. And so you add a decade, all of a sudden, the law that was then said back in 2012, 2013, when all of these issues were addressed, they were brought in and it was not deemed to be mandatory, so the legislation was deemed to be voluntary. And look, no power utility, no company voluntarily spent the money to get their plants up to spec. What's going to be the results of this? Well, now all of a sudden you're ending up having a legislature that's acting all holier than thou, and really they are. If you read a lot of what the legislatures are now doing, some of the legislators who I'm going to give the credit of the doubt that they weren't aware of what was going on, and these men and women were not legislators back then. But many of the veterans from 10 years ago just are like going, well, you know, they do this political doublespeak and effectively are ignoring the issue yet again. All because maybe it's the industry is one of their main sponsors or one of their main contributors, so there is a political vested interest not to do this. It could be that they just don't want to do anything because if you start doing something, there's the political risk that it could backfire. There's a whole litmus of reasons why legislators don't act on what they're supposed to. But the end result, unfortunately, is still the same. 10 years ago, a report was issued that stated that the reason why the power grid had failed and why there's all this secondary and tertiary problems caused by the lack of the power was because the systems were hit at the critical power generating points because they weren't weatherized. The end result is that there was insufficient power supply to the demand. The demand during this crisis peaked because people needed to heat their homes. Unable to heat their homes or unable to get power to the water systems and what have you, ended up resulting in people freezing in their homes, people using, well, heaters that were probably generating carbon monoxide, fires that broke out that couldn't be fought because water mains were themselves not weatherized and they had to use other pumps. So the systems, even if these these fire hydrants were able to supply water, they couldn't supply enough water because the entire system was down because the main pumps back at the water distribution plants were shut down because there wasn't enough power. So when you have the critical infrastructure hit, the secondary and the tertiary effect is deaths, lack of power, a hit to the economy, and generally speaking, the 2021 repeat power crisis. I'm Darren, this is Danger by Degrees. As said, we're on Facebook, We're on YouTube. We now have our own website. Come and visit. Share, subscribe. We're also on DTube. We're going to have our own blog soon. All of this is going to be available. Share with us. Join with us. Let's make these videos viral in a good way, not in a bad way like a certain virus we don't want to talk about. And I'll see you later.